2025 proposed budget for your review. We do this in September every year so that you have a chance to review the specifics of the budget over the next couple of months. And then we'll come back in November and represent the budget to you for your approval for the next year. The information, the actual line item budget itself was available as part of the meeting materials. So you can have a chance to look at each of the line items over the next couple of months to determine what your questions might be. But this first slide that will be up on the screen gives us the overview of this year's budget. We have a proposed income and revenue budget of $657,444. We have an expense budget of $679,261, which gives us a deficit of $21,818. And we're going to talk about each one of these items in specific. Bear in mind that the income for 2025 is actually a 2% increase over what we have in this year's budget. The expenses for 2025 actually are a 4% decrease over the expenses of this year. And we have made significant progress in our commitment to reducing our deficit budgeting. The next slide. The primary changes for 2025 that we're going to talk about in some detail are up on the slide here. Basically, we're proposing an increase in the per capita assessment. We are going to propose modeling a new way of doing per capita payment to the Synod and the General Assembly, which we'll talk about in some detail. You've already heard the exciting news about the Board of Pensions, and we have had to budget for those changes in the budget for our own staff. And as I mentioned, we have a decrease in our budget from what we have currently for this year. In terms of overall ministry for the presbytery, not much has changed. And so our ministry expenses and so on are relatively unchanged going into 2025. Let's look at the different factors for the 2025 budget. The per capita assessment is based on our membership of the churches and the members of the presbytery as of December 31st of 2023. So that 110,322 is actually a little bit of a decrease over what it was in 2022 on December 31st. And so that has a little bit of an effect on calculating our per capita income. Our missional giving is based on data of what we received over the last 3 or so years. And our investment income is going to be based on slightly increasing our annual draw from our ministry and mission fund, as well as the other 2 funds that we have available to us, which we'll talk about in some detail. The per capita that we are going to be proposing for the presbytery is $43.50. You can see that the General Assembly and the Synod have both increased. Well, you may not be aware of it, but I'm telling you that the General Assembly increased their per capita figure for this year, and the Synod also increased their percentage. We will talk about how we're going to be dealing with those in a few minutes. Let's go on to the next slide, in which we'll take a look at our overview of our expenses. The administration budget for the year, which is basically the cost of operating the presbytery headquarters and employing staff and so on. That budget has gone up slightly from the current year, 2024 for 2025 by about $9,000. And most of this is the result of factoring in the transitional pastors package from the Board of Pensions for our two ordained staff members, Gene and Steve. So they are in the budget at the transitional package rate for 2025. And we have proposed a 2% cost of living increase for our two non-ordained staff members, Liz and Sonia. And so those numbers are all included in this $491,000. The Presbytery team's budget, for the most part, is flat. There's one $6,000 change, and that is that for the last year, we have had $8,000 in the ACT budget to help fund the process of going through our discernment for our new vision and vocation statement. And because we are nearing the end of that process, we have reduced the expense for discernment for this next year to just $2,000. Our missional partners, we will talk about as part of how we're going to be doing a new way of General Assembly and Synod per capita. The next slide, which is the income and revenue overview, shows that our per capita budget income for the year is proposed at $368,186. When you add the $43.50 for all 110,000 members of the Presbytery, it would come up to $449,000. But we always have a number of churches that either won't or don't or can't pay 100% of their assessment. And so we budget an amount in the budget to take that into account. For years, we were at 20%. For this year, we reduced it to 18%, and we're continuing that 18% budgeting factor for 2025, which means that that $449,000 gets reduced to our total per capita budget of $368,186. Our total investment income budget is based on drawing from our ministry and mission fund, from the Chestnut Fund, and from our permanent endowment funds. The ministry and mission fund draw has been for several years at 5%. We're proposing in the budget for 2025 that it be increased to a 5.5% draw, which would give us $244,895. We take 4% from the Chestnut Fund, of the income from the Chestnut Fund, and we take 4% from the income earned in our permanent funds. Our missional giving is, again, it's based on what we have experienced over the last several years. That gives us a total income budget of $657,444 that we're proposing for the year. Now, the major expense besides paying for the operation of the headquarters and so on that we always have is paying the General Assembly and the Synod their per capita assessment. And we are proposing for this next year that we model for the entire denomination a new way of doing Synod and General Assembly per capita. And to explain that in more detail, I'm going to call on our leader, Gene, to give us a more detailed explanation.
As you can see on the screen, it's a percentage model. So what is the percentage model? And we didn't just decide, at a meeting a month ago to do something different. This is based on something that has been going on for several years. In 2016 to 2017, the Presbytery of Newton overtured the General Assembly to review and, if necessary, change the model of funding for the whole denomination. So we started this. We have been using the per capita model for the funding of the church for over 150 years. So this very short, obscure little overture made it through the General Assembly, and a financial sustainability and per capita review team was formed Because of the pandemic, the work of the committee lasted 4 years instead of 2. And from that work of the GA committee, it generated 2 things. One was the unification of the Presbyterian Mission Agency and the Office of the General Assembly, which is in process, where the PMA and the OGA are going to be unified into one unit. And then the other part from that came the funding model development team. And I served on that first team, and I also serve on the funding model team. One of the 2 models that we are working with is the percentage model. This funding is based on a percentage of income. Before you jump to the questions that all that statement brings, I want to insert that the funding model team is literally at the starting line of this model. We're still very much in the development, and we are gathering information and talking with other Presbyterian entities about how to develop and form this model more. Because Highlands, via Newton Presbytery, was the originator of the process, the ACT has agreed to be part of that initial data gathering and testing the components of this model. So our budget is for the General Assembly and the Synod is based on a percentage of the presbytery's income. So 15% of our income, which will include investment income and per capita income, 15% will go to the General Assembly and 4% will go to the Synod. This amount will be paid quarterly, depending on how much income is received in each quarter. So everything else remains the same, meaning your churches are still paying per capita and missional giving. And this will just be used as some data that we can use for the GA funding model team. John Wilkinson, who is there with you today, is there to meet with some folks after the meeting to talk about how to help our presbytery communicate more effectively about funding and stewardship, so we can see if that makes a difference in our per capita and our income. So it's all John's part of what this team is doing, and part of what we're doing is the percentage model is doing that. Now, the one question you may say, is this going to be under our, does this change what we are required to pay? We think it's going to come close to what our Board of Pensions payment would have been anyway, not our Board of Pensions, our GA per capita payment would be. It's probably a little bit less, but it all depends on how much income we get. So this is part of that data gathering we're using for this funding model for the General Assembly.
All of that is a long way of saying we're going to try a little bit different way of paying General Assembly and Synod their per capita assessments for this next year. And that has affected how we have budgeted for our expenses for the year. Let me go to the highlights of the 2025 budget. And you can see that our revenue for the year is essentially relatively similar to what we've had for 2024. There's some minor changes, such as increasing the investment draw to 5.5% from ministry and mission funds. We have kept the uncollected per capita rate at the same as for 2024 at 18%. Our expenses take into account the necessity to budget for the transitional pastors packaging for the Board of Pensions, for Gene and for Steve. And it takes into account the 2% cost of living increase that we are giving to Liz and to Sonia. But the rest of the expense budget is really focused on our continuing to support the congregations that make up our presbytery. Several years ago, we made a commitment to reducing our deficit budgeting. I remember when I first became active, we were, I think, at the neighborhood of $160,000 deficits in budgeting. And we have made enormous progress in getting closer to reducing that. And we're happy about that. A reminder, however, that if all churches were to pay 100% of their per capita assessment, we would completely wipe out the $21,000 deficit that's budgeted for this year, and we would finish the year $60,000 in the black. We recognize that that's not going to happen in simple terms, but again, as more and more churches can pay more and more of their per capita assessment, we will continue to make progress in reducing our overall deficit. This budget is going to be using that percentage model for paying General Assembly and Synod, and it will obviously be something that a lot of people will be watching to see how that works, and we'll be gathering a lot of data so that we can make reports on how that works. But we are going to be a leader in beginning this national experience on how we change per capita budgeting for churches and for presbyteries. All of that being said, this is the first draft of the budget for you to review. You have the line-by-line budget in the meeting materials. If you have questions or feedback about the budget that you want to provide, please send it to the Presbytery office, and we will respond as appropriate over the next couple of months. We'll come back in November with the final budget for action of adoption by the Presbytery. But in the meantime, in order for churches to do their budgeting this fall, we need to adopt the per capita assessment rate for 2025. And so, Mr. Vice Moderator, on behalf of the administration and coordinating team, I move that the Presbytery adopt $43.50 as the per capita assessment for 2025.
Thank you, Pete, for that super thorough presentation of the first reading of our budget for 2025. There is a motion on the floor. It doesn't need a second. And so if there are no questions about the motion, which is to raise the per capita of $43.50 for 2025, I guess increase is the proper word there. You have the motion before you. If there are no questions regarding the motion, I call for the question. All those in favor? Oh, got a question back there, Stephen? Sure. If you come to the mic, that would be great. Thank you. I know it's a long journey. We got to include our Zoom guests or, participants. Thank you.
Stephen Park Choi, minister member of the Stewartsville Presbyterian Church. We ran into this issue 2 years ago when we set the per capita earlier than the Synod Assembly. And so the Synod amount that you have before you still needs to be approved at the October Synod Assembly meeting. So in other words, it could be decreased or it could even be increased. So I guess my question is, can this wait until the November meeting after the Synod Assembly?
Yeah, I'll let Pete speak to that.
Thank you for that observation. And the short answer to your question is no, we're not going to wait. Principally because what we're doing is modeling a new way of paying per capita to both the Synod and the General Assembly by using our new percentage model. So regardless of what the Synod sets as its per capita, we are going to pay 4% of whatever income we get during 2025 to the Synod as Highlands Presbytery portion for per capita assessment. So it does not moot the motion that we need to have approved to set our per capita assessment at $43.50.
Thanks for the point, Stephen, because I think that's actually a helpful clarification for what this percentage model looks like and how that influences, what we pay out. This is sort of more about the income side, right? Yeah. Are there further questions? Comments? Okay, we'll call for the question. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And I think you're using the raise hand or green check mark or something online.
There's a question in the comments.
Oh. All right,
The question is not related to this, so I'll
Okay.
answer that afterwards.
great, thank you. You can put your hands down. Thank you, everyone. All those opposed, please vote now. Okay. I believe the motion carries as there's an abundance of yays. And so the per capita will be increased to $43.50. Pete, I believe we have a little more ACT work.
We do.
Pete, it's Jean.
Yes, Jane.
There is a question about the budget that I can answer. Can you clarify, and I'll answer this. This is from Julie. Can you clarify if the transitional pastor package is actually the choice of the two Presbyterian employees, or are you using that in place of budgeting for the Board of Pensions plan? The interesting thing, and it's a good question, Julie, because Steve and I are the only members of the presbytery in the pastor participation package who do not qualify for the congregational pastor package. So we only after in 2025, we technically only qualify for the covenant package or the transitional package. We don't qualify for the other one because they set the boundaries as it is for only people serving congregations. They do not see mid-council presbytery leaders as serving congregations. Needless to say, a lot of mid-council leaders have had a lot to say about this, and maybe this might change in 2026. So we didn't have a choice. It was either the covenant package or the transitional package, and we were unable to get, we're still in the process of trying to find out what the covenant package would cost. So we had to put the transitional package in the budget until we know. Thanks for the question.
Again, for anyone else who might have questions about either the budget or obviously how the changes in the Board of Pensions are going to affect your church's budgeting and so on, please feel free to send your questions to the Presbytery office. The ACT has several